The wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a wounded beast, carrying the bite of winter and the promise of another brutal night. Down in the valley, the Dugan Ranch squatted against the snow like a dark scar on the land. Inside that lonely house, Clara Whitmore pressed her face to the frost-covered window and watched the storm clouds roll in. 2 years. That's how long it had been since she'd come west as Hank Dugan's bride. 2 long years since her father had sealed her fate with a handshake and a business deal in Philadelphia. She'd been 19 then, young and full of stories about brave men and wide skies. Now she was 21, and her dreams lay shattered like the china cup Hank had thrown at her that morning. The door slammed open behind her. A gust of icy wind swept in, carrying snow and the sharp smell of whiskey. Hank Dugan filled the doorway like a bear, his heavy coat still dusted white. Even from across the room she could smell the liquor on him. "Where's my supper?" he growled, kicking the door shut. Clara's hands trembled as she smoothed her patched dress. "It's on the stove, keeping warm. I didn't know when you'd—" "That's your problem, woman. You don't know nothing." He threw his coat to the floor where she'd have to pick it up later. "Met Joe Patterson in town. Says he saw you talking to that merchant last week." Her heart stumbled. "I only bought thread and—" The back of his hand cracked across her face. The world spun. Pain exploded along her cheek as she crashed against the table. "You don't talk to no man without my say-so?" Hank hissed. "You hear me? You're mine, Clara. Bought and paid for, same as the cattle out there." She kept her eyes down. She'd learned that looking up only made it worse. "Yes, Hank?" "Yes, what?" "Yes, husband." He grunted and dropped into his chair. Clara moved automatically, ladling out the stew she'd kept simmering all day. She poured his coffee with hands that barely shook now. She'd gotten good at pretending calm, good at being small and quiet. Hank ate noisily, talking about the man he'd cheated at cards, the ranchers who owed him money, the rifles he planned to sell next month that would make him rich. Clara stood by the stove, staring at the fire and pretending to listen. Her mind drifted far away, to Philadelphia, to her mother's piano, to a time when her life hadn't felt like a prison. Her mother was gone now, 3 years dead. Maybe it was a mercy she hadn't lived to see what became of her daughter. Clara's father had traded her for business and money, sending her west to a man twice her age. "You ain't eating," Hank muttered, his mouth full. "I'm not hungry." "Ungrateful," he snapped, pointing his spoon. Another woman would be glad to have a roof and a man to feed her. Another woman might not have bruises under her sleeves, Clara thought. Another woman might not flinch at footsteps. But she said nothing. The meal ended in thick silence, broken only by Hank's chewing. Outside, the storm grew louder, rattling the shutters. Finally, Hank stood and shoved back his chair. "I'm going to check the horses," he said. "When I get back, you'd best be ready to show me some appreciation for all I do for you." The door slammed. Clara sagged against the stove, her knees weak. She knew what appreciation meant. Her ribs still ached from last week's version of it. Through the window, she could see Hank's bulky figure weaving toward the barn, already half drunk. The snow was falling thick now, swallowing him in white. Something inside her snapped. Maybe it had been breaking for months, maybe years, but now it gave way. She looked around the kitchen, the bloodstain she could never scrub out, the pile of mending that never ended, the walls that felt like they were closing in. She grabbed her heaviest shawl from its hook and wrapped it around herself. Her coat was gone. Hank had sold it last winter to pay a gambling debt. From the drawer she pulled the small cloth bag where she'd hidden $2 silver, saved coin by coin from grocery money. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She paused at the door. Beyond the ranch stretched miles of open land and wilderness. North lay the mountains. Dangerous, snow-choked, but the one direction Hank would never expect her to take. Everyone knew those mountains could kill a person faster than any bullet. But Clara thought dying in the clean cold might be better than dying a little each day in this house. She stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a slap, tearing at her shawl, stealing her breath. Snow stung her face and soaked her thin boots, but she didn't turn back. Behind her, the ranch lights faded into the storm. Ahead was nothing but white and shadow. Each step hurt. The cold bit through her clothes, numbing her fingers, but she kept moving. She thought of Hank's voice, of his fists, of every time she'd been told she was nothing. She would rather freeze than hear those words again. The snow deepened to her knees. Her feet stumbled over hidden rocks and roots. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Still, she pressed on, a tiny figure swallowed by a raging storm. When she finally fell, the snow caught her like a blanket. She curled up, too tired to stand, too numb to feel the cold anymore. Her eyes fluttered shut. Far away, across the white hills, another figure rode through the storm. A man named Cain. He was a trapper, a loner who'd lived in these mountains so long he could read the weather like scripture. The storm rolling in was a killer. He knew it, by the way. The clouds stacked and the wind screamed through the pines. Most men would have turned back hours ago, but Elijah was used to storms. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw something, or someone, lying still in the drift ahead. He pulled his horse to a stop. "Whoa, Moses," he murmured, swinging down. At first, he thought it was a deer. Then he saw the blue fabric, the dark hair half buried in snow. "Dear God," he breathed. The woman's skin was ice cold, her lips blue, but when he pressed his fingers to her throat, he felt it. Faint, but there. A heartbeat. Without hesitation, Elijah stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She was so light, it felt like carrying smoke. "Don't you go dying on me, ma'am," he muttered. "I got enough ghosts already." Quote. He laid her across his horse and led the way through the blizzard. The wind fought him every step, but he kept going, head down, muscles burning. By the time he reached his cabin, his hands were numb, his legs heavy as stone. He pushed the door open, stumbled inside, and kicked it shut behind him. The fire was low, but enough to see her face. Bruises, faded and fresh, a mark on her throat shaped like a hand. Elijah felt a familiar ache in his chest, the memory of violence, of loss. He built up the fire until it roared, then stripped away her frozen clothes, replacing them with blankets from his bed. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered, working as quickly and carefully as he could. "But if I don't, you won't live till morning." When she was wrapped tight and close to the fire, he hesitated. She was still cold, her breathing shallow. The only way to keep her alive was to share his warmth. Elijah hesitated only a second longer, then lay beside her under the blankets. "Just for heat," he told the empty room. "That's all." Quote. Outside, the storm roared, and the wind beat at the cabin walls. But inside, the firelight flickered over two broken souls, one unconscious, one haunted, and somewhere in the darkness between them, hope began to stir again. The storm raged all night, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney like a living thing. Cain lay awake beside the stranger he'd dragged from the snow, listening to her shallow breathing. Every time it hitched, he turned his head, waiting for the sound to even out again. By dawn, his muscles ached from staying still, afraid that moving might take away the little warmth she'd gained. When the gray light crept across the cabin floor, he felt her body begin to tremble, the kind of shaking that meant life was clawing its way back. He sat up and leaned over her. "Easy now," he murmured. "You hold on. You made it through the worst of it." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a second Elijah saw the wild panic in them before she jerked away, clutching the blanket to her chin. "Don't touch me," she gasped, voice cracked and hoarse. Elijah lifted his hands, palms out. "You're safe, ma'am. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Her eyes darted around the cabin. The fire, the kettle, the unfamiliar man crouched a few feet away. She pulled the blankets tighter, shaking harder. "Your clothes were frozen," he said quietly. "Would have killed you if I left them on. They're drying by the fire." "I didn't mean no disrespect, just trying to save your life." For a long moment she stared at him, trying to decide if she believed him. Finally, the tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. Where? Where am I? My cabin, Elijah said, 10 miles north of Beaver Creek. Found you last night half buried in the snow. He pointed to the window, where white still pressed thick against the glass. Storm's not done yet. You picked a bad night to be out walking. At that, her composure cracked. She turned away, face hidden in the blanket. Elijah heard the quiet sound of her crying, not loud, just the broken kind that comes from deep down. He gave her the privacy of silence, moving to stoke the fire and set the kettle back on. I'll make you some tea, he said. You look like you could use something warm. A few minutes later, he poured her a tin cup and slid it across the table before stepping outside to give her room. The cold hit him like a wall, but it was better than sitting in that cabin, feeling her fear thick in the air. When he came back in, she was sitting near the fire, wrapped in his old wool shirt and trousers that hung loose on her frame. Her dark hair, now dry, spilled over her shoulders. Beneath the bruises, Elijah could see she was young, too young to carry eyes that tired. "Thank you," she said softly, without meeting his gaze. "Don't mention it." He poured himself coffee, sat across from her, and waited. "My name's Clara," she said after a long pause. "Clara Whitmore, Dogan." Elijah froze halfway to his mouth with the cup. "Dogan?" She nodded. "You know the name." "Hard not to," Elijah muttered. "Hank Duggan's known around here. Cattle, cards, whiskey, none of it good." Her hands tightened on the cup. "I was his wife." Quote. The way she said it, quiet, steady, but hollow, made something twist inside Elijah's chest. He set his cup down. "You running from him?" Her nod was small but certain. "He's not a man who lets go of what he owns." "Man like that shouldn't own anything, let alone a person." Elijah leaned back in his chair. "You're safe here. He won't find you in these mountains." "He'll come," Clara whispered. "He always does." "Let him try," Elijah said. "Storm's still thick enough to hide 1,000 miles between here and him." They sat in silence a while, listening to the wind die down. Elijah busied himself frying bacon and biscuits. He set a plate in front of her, and for a long minute she just stared before picking up the fork. The first bite brought tears to her eyes, not because of taste, but because it had been so long since someone had fed her without anger. When she finished, Elijah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You can stay here till the storm passes," he said. "Then we'll figure what comes next. Nobody's gonna hurt you under my roof." Quote. Clara looked up at him then, really looked. His face was weathered, beard flecked with gray, eyes the color of pine bark. He wasn't handsome, but there was something steady in him, the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" He thought for a moment, then said quietly, "Because once, someone helped me when I didn't deserve it. Guess it's my turn to pay that back." Clara didn't answer, but a flicker of trust softened her expression. She reached for the needle and thread she'd spotted on the shelf. "I can mend that shirt you're wearing," she offered. "It'll give me something to do." "You don't have to." "I want to." He nodded and handed it over. For the next hour, the only sound in the cabin was the steady rhythm of thread through fabric and the crackle of fire. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "He hit me the first time on our wedding night," she said. "I cried because I missed my mother. He said I was ungrateful." Elijah's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. "It got worse after we came west," she continued. "No family, no neighbors close enough to hear. I learned to count the days by the bruises." He set his tools down, staring into the fire. "A man like that," he stopped himself, "a man like that's already damned, whether he knows it or not." She glanced up. "And what about you, Mr. Cain? Who do you hide from up here?" For a long moment, Elijah didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Not who, what?" He poked the fire with the poker. "War took my wife and daughter while I was away fighting it. Cabin burned with them inside. I came up here to stop feeling anything." Clara's breath caught. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. They've been gone 7 years. Mountains don't judge. They just let a man be quiet." She studied him, the sadness beneath his calm. "You saved me, Elijah." Maybe the mountains sent you." He gave a small, tired smile. "If the mountains are in the business of saving souls now, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Outside, the storm began to fade. Inside, something warmer took its place. Over the next few days, as the snow melted into glittering ice, they fell into a rhythm. She mended, cooked, and cleaned. He trapped, chopped wood, and repaired tools. The silence between them changed. It no longer felt heavy, but companionable. On the third morning, Clara stood outside, watching the mountains shimmer under a pale sun. Elijah joined her, handing her his rifle. "You ever shot one?" She shook her head. Hank said women didn't need guns. Elijah adjusted her stance, steadying her hands. "That's what men say when they're scared of women being strong." She looked at him, the rifle solid in her grasp. "I don't ever want to be afraid again." "You won't," Elijah said, meeting her eyes. "Not while I'm breathing." Clara turned back toward the target, but her heartbeat wasn't steady because of the gun. It was because of the way he'd said it, not as a promise of protection, but as if he believed she could protect herself. When she fired, the shot echoed off the mountains, sharp and certain, and for the first time in years, Clara felt a piece of her old self return, the part that had believed in freedom, in courage, in something close to hope. Spring crept slowly over the Colorado mountains. The snow melted first from the high ridges, then the valleys, leaving the world soft and green again. Clara and Elijah had fallen into a steady rhythm of work and quiet companionship. What had begun as rescue had turned into something gentler, deeper, though neither dared name it aloud. Every morning, Clara practiced shooting behind the cabin. Elijah stood beside her, calm and patient, correcting her aim with quiet words. Each shot grew truer than the last. Each day her shoulders squared a little more. The bruises had faded from her skin, but not from her memory. Elijah never asked about them again. He didn't have to. He saw her healing in the way she carried herself, in the way she laughed sometimes now, without fear. One afternoon, while they were chopping wood, Clara's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "He'll come," she said softly. "You know he will." Quote. Elijah paused, resting his axe against the stump. "Let him," he replied. "I faced worse than men like Hank Dugan." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "This time, I won't hide behind anyone." He gave a faint smile. "I know." That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara finally told him the rest, the part she'd never spoken aloud. About the day she'd almost taken her own life, about the quiet promise she made to herself instead, that if she ever had the chance to run, she'd never stop until she found a life worth living. When she finished, Elijah reached across the table and covered her trembling hand with his rough, calloused one. "You found it," he said quietly. "You found that life." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not pity, not comfort, but recognition. Two broken souls, each carrying their own ghosts, seeing in the other a mirror of their own survival. It was that moment when the horses screamed outside. Elijah was on his feet before the echo died. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The moonlight glinted off steel. 3 riders heading up the valley. Clara went cold. "Hank!" "Stay down," Elijah ordered, moving toward the door. But she was already reaching for her rifle. "No, not this time. I won't hide while another man fights my battle." He turned to argue, but stopped when he saw the resolve in her face. She was done being afraid. They took positions. Elijah by the door, Clara crouched by the window. The riders halted in the yard, their silhouettes black against the pale snowmelt. "Cain," a voice bellowed, thick with whiskey and rage. "I know she's in there. You can hand her over, or I can burn you both out." Clara's fingers tightened on the rifle. That voice still had the power to make her heart race. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was fury. "Not another word," Elijah muttered, stepping out onto the porch. "You take one more step toward this cabin, Dugan, and I'll put you in the ground." Laughter echoed back. "She's my wife. Law says so. You got no right to keep her." Inside, Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She could see Hank's shape through the window, the same broad shoulders, the same cruel stance, a shadow of every nightmare she'd lived through. She remembered the cold floor, the shattered dishes, the years of silence. Then she remembered Elijah's voice, calm and sure, telling her she'd never be afraid again. Her hand stopped shaking. When Hank raised his gun, Clara didn't hesitate. The rifle cracked once. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder. Hank's weapon fell from his hand, his shoulder twisting back. He staggered, eyes wide with shock. You shot me?" Clara stepped into the doorway, the rifle still steady in her grip. "I did," she said, "because I'd rather live free for 1 minute than as your property for a lifetime." Hank's men spurred their horses in panic, dragging him back down the trail, leaving only silence behind. Elijah lowered his rifle slowly, eyes fixed on her. "You didn't just defend yourself," he said. "You ended it." She nodded. "It's over." He stepped forward, gently taking the rifle from her trembling hands. "It's over," he repeated, his voice softer now. Then he did what no one had ever done for her. He pulled her into his arms. For a long moment she stood rigid, the habit of fear holding her still. But then she let herself lean into him, her forehead pressed to his chest, his warmth steady against her. The tears came then, not from pain, but from release. "It's all right," Elijah whispered, his hand tracing soothing circles across her back. "You're safe now. You're safe." Days later, they rode into town together to give their statements to Sheriff Watson. The law called it self-defense, plain and simple. Hank Dugan's reign of fear had ended where it began, in his own violence. Clara's name was cleared. She was free in every sense that mattered. When the papers were signed and the witnesses dismissed, she stood outside the courthouse, staring at the open sky. "It feels strange," she said softly, "to have nowhere I have to be, no one telling me what I can or can't do." Elijah smiled faintly. "Freedom always feels strange at first. Takes time to fit right." Quote. She turned to him then, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" He took her hand. "Now we build something better." That spring, they returned to the cabin together. They fixed the roof, planted a garden, and patched the bullet holes from that final night. Clara learned to ride alone into town, head held high, no longer the timid woman hiding behind her bruises. Elijah learned to smile again, to let laughter replace silence. When the wildflowers bloomed in the meadow, they stood hand in hand on the porch, watching the sun set over the peaks. The world smelled of pine and new life. "You've given me back something I thought was gone forever," Elijah said quietly. "What's that?" Clara asked. "Hope." She turned to him, her eyes bright in the fading light. "You didn't give me hope, Elijah. You reminded me I already had it." He brushed his thumb over the faint scar on her cheek, the last trace of her old life. "You'll heal in my arms," he whispered. "I already am," she replied. And under the vast, golden sky of the Colorado frontier, the lonely rancher and the broken bride began again. Not as savior and victim, but as two survivors who had chosen love over fear, and life over the darkness that once claimed them both.